Are implantable devices potentially a game-changing step forward in medicine? Welcome to the latest edition of E+T's Off the Page podcast, in which we will be looking at an area of medical technology that seems increasingly likely to touch all of our lives at some point in the future, that of implantable devices. It's an area that's been around for decades, but is it at an inflection point? I'm Tim Fryer, and I'm joined as always by my editorial colleague, Jack Loughran. But unfortunately, our third team member, Tanya, has been struck down by illness. So it'll just be the two of us today asking the questions to our expert. And that expert is Nick Donaldson, Professor of Neuroprosthesis Engineering at University College London. Welcome, Nick. The first pacemaker was installed in 1958. And despite some earlier attempts, it was the 1960s, I believe, that knee and hip replacements started becoming more regular surgeries. So, Nick, what were the lessons being learnt in those pioneering days? And it's an unfairly big question, but how far have we come in the intervening 60 or so years?
We've come a long way. In the earliest devices, and I'm talking about neurological devices here, not orthopedic devices, neurological devices, first pacemaker implants, were enabled by the availability of transistors. So before the Second World War, a pacemaker meant a trolley with valve stimulators mounted on it, wheeled up to the patient, and such a thing kept a few people alive for a short amount of time. When the transistor came along, then stimulators were made with transistors and a few other components encapsulated in epoxy resin, and these, during the 1960s, tended to fail quite quickly because they didn't really understand how to encapsulate the devices properly. So the insulation broke down and the battery inside it caused electrolysis and destruction of the package.
And is that because the human body basically attacks it as a foreign object? Or
No, I would say primarily it's simply because inside the body is a bit like seawater. It's warm, salty. Chloride ions are very aggressive, so the water breaks adhesion between the encapsulant and the components and allows ionic currents to start flowing.
So part of that journey has been the development of materials that last longer.
Yes, at the beginning of the 70s, an Australian engineer produced the first sort of modern type pacemaker type implant. So that's something which has a titanium can, a metal enclosure with the electronics inside it, in gas, so it's gas-filled metal enclosure with glass feed-throughs, bringing the electrical signals in and out of the enclosure, and just a small amount of encapsulant around that where the cables are joined on to the outside. And that was sort of immediately successful and has been used ever since. That's the standard type of implant. And I think we've probably reached the limit of what one can do with that now, because we're now wanting implants which are significantly smaller than what is possible with metal cans.
Okay. All right then. But if we move on to your area of expertise. Now, your title is Professor of Neuroprosthesis Engineering. So what does that mean?
Well, neuroprostheses are devices to try and replace part of the nervous system. And I suppose what it meant back in the day when I started was mostly trying to replace function in people who were paralyzed. So that's what I've spent most of my career working on, trying to help people with spinal cord injury to restore leg function. So in the 80s, I was making implanted devices which had lots of outputs, lots of electrodes which were implanted on nerves going to muscles in the paralyzed part of the body, and we tried to stimulate those with the right sequences to get leg movements in order to allow the person to walk again. It was very ambitious.
So it's not about controlling a prosthetic, as in a replacement arm. It is, in some cases, it is about controlling existing limbs that are not communicating with the body.
Yes. So what people mean by prostheses is generally devices for replacing limbs. So prosthetic arms, prosthetic legs, and so on. But a neuroprosthesis is something to replace the nerves which are malfunctional.
so is that something that is commonplace these days, implants like that?
No,
No.
it's not. So that direction of travel sort of petered out in about 1990
Right.
as we realized that this was really just too difficult. And I suppose I thought of it originally as being a bit like being given a robot without any control system and having to make the control system for the robot.
Because the original nerves have been severed.
Because the nerves have been severed, so we just wanted to replace the nerves and activation of the nerves in the right way. But the trouble is, of course, that the real body has a huge amount of feedback built into it. It's very, very complicated. And the idea that one can just replace that with artificial things, it's not impossible, but the burden on the patient, the amount of things you'd have to implant, or the amount of cabling and things they'd have to wear in order to do it, certainly around 1990 just seemed to be completely impractical. And so we gave up doing that.
So you researched that for a few years and then decided to move on to other things.
Yes.
Is that technology in the intervening years, so is it a more realistic proposition in 2025?
Definitely. We know a huge amount more about controlling robots, obviously. So there are now walking robots, which there weren't then. So a lot of it, I'm sure, is much more available. But the other thing probably is the need has changed. So when I began in the late 70s, we thought of most paraplegic patients as being completely paralyzed. So we just thought of them as the upper body and the lower body, and the lower body is completely paralyzed. Whereas actually it's probably something like only 10% now of people with spinal cord injury have no connection between the brain and the lower limbs. They may still be effectively paralyzed, but there are nerve fibers passing the lesion, and I think of it more as the job is to retrain the body to bring into use these neurons that are functionally inactive at the moment.
And you will have to excuse this as a stupid question, but in my mind, I see the brain as the processor and the spinal cord as the communications route. But some of these implants can go in the brain or the top of the spinal cord, or can actually go in the spinal cord itself. Is that right? Electronic devices in the spinal cord overriding what the brain is supposed to do in its processing role.
There have been implants in the spinal cord, but only for research, I think. People talk about spinal cord stimulation, but it's a misnomer. What they're really doing is stimulating with electrodes which are outside the spinal cord. And if these electrodes are placed behind the spinal cord, so posterior side of the spinal cord, what they're doing is stimulating the afferent fibers going in there. So the way the body's arranged is that motor fibers come out at the front of the spinal cord and go to the muscles. Sensory fibers come up and go in at the back of the spinal cord. And those are the fibers that are stimulated in a so-called spinal cord stimulator. Most of those devices are implanted for alleviating chronic pain. I don't understand what the mechanism is for doing that, but that's what they do. Really interesting field of research at the moment is stimulating the posterior spinal cord, the fibers going there, in order to restore limb function. So rather than thinking about what we used to do, stimulating the motor fibers going to the muscles, you stimulate the sensory fibers going into the spinal cord, and that has complicated effects. Now, if you do it at high intensity, then you can stimulate the nervous structures in the spinal cord that produce stereotype motion. So if you hang your patient up in a parachute harness and stimulate at high intensity, you may get his legs to do sort of primitive walking because you're stimulating the stepping generators, coupled stepping generators in the legs.
So are you trying to adjust the sensory input to the spinal cord then, and hoping that will have an effect on how the motor output reacts to it?
Yes. If you stimulate at lower levels, so you're stimulating the large afferent fibers, it acts like opening a gate. So the brain may have been unable to make muscles contract. But when you start stimulating the afferent fibers at the right level, then it lets the signals come through from the brain to the muscles, and the patient is able to move their limbs again.
What sort of damage could have occurred to any of these fibers that would make them redundant but still reusable or re-stimulatable?
Well, I'm talking about people with spinal cord injury, where the majority have so-called upper motor neurons go from the brain, from the motor cortex, down to the spinal cord. But there aren't enough of them in these patients after the injury to cause the muscles to contract. And by stimulating the afferents behind the spinal cord, then that strengthens the pathway. and means there's enough signal getting through to cause motor neurons going to the muscles to act.
So where are we in terms of current technology? Are these devices still in the research phase, or are they actively being used in patients? And if so, kind of what's the trajectory of these kind of devices going forward?
That's a $50,000 question. This method is in research at the moment. There's at least one company developing implants specifically for this sort of thing. I think myself that the question is very much what is going to be the best use of these techniques widely in the spinal cord injured population. So one line of work, which has been led by a professor called Grégoire Courtine in Switzerland, has developed this method into something more like sort of neuroprosthesis, where you try and stimulate the afferent fibers phasically with the stepping to try and get the best possible stepping. And that undoubtedly has produced dramatic results in a very small number of patients. But to do that requires not only the implant, but a huge amount of training and assistance from a large technical team. And so if you think what we're trying to do is to raise the standard of living for the huge number of people who live with spinal cord injury, we want methods, I think, which are much cheaper and simpler than that. And just stimulating continuously, atomically, these afferent fibers may be enough to enable the person to start retraining their body again in a sort of very useful way.
But you say may be enough, so we're not quite...
We haven't done enough of it, as far as I can see yet, to be able to go to the National Health Service and say, you ought to put money into this because you would reduce the disability of this many people this amount.
So like moving on away from the spinal cord to brain implants, I mean, this seems like a whole other kettle of fish, if you excuse the term, because, I mean, at the end of the day, the spinal cord is simply moving electrons from one part of the body to another to allow some kind of electrical control, whereas the brain is a much more complex organ and a lot more unknown from what I understand. Okay, so this is the level I'm at. I watched an episode of Black Mirror a few months ago in the new series. Very good show. I don't know if you've seen it. A woman gets a brain tumor and she has to have a part of her brain removed. That bit of her brain is removed and then it's replaced with basically a synthetic brain tissue which is able to replace all the function that she lost from her original bit of brain that had to be removed. Is that something? Is that a realistic technology? Is that something that is being explored?
I haven't the faintest idea. It's completely outside my experience.
Fair enough.
If it's true, I suppose this was stem cells. Was it stem cells being used to regenerate part of the brain, and then those neurons, which must have formed, must have reconnected within the brain and become functionally useful. I don't know how difficult it is to prove that they're functionally useful.
I mean, I'm not sure they went into that much detail in this particular episode of a TV show, but
I think the thing to get across is that a lot of patients have brain implants already, and they're mostly so-called deep brain implants. So, that means putting a sort of probe down into the brain from the surface with electrodes near its end, and the neurosurgeon has to find the place within the brain where stimulation there has the desired effect. So there are people with, say, dystonia, so a very difficult sort of motor condition which is hard to live with, which clearly, if you watch a movie of them doing this, they really struggle to do anything. And then the stimulation is turned on, it just stops. So they suddenly just look normal. And this can make a huge difference. And that method has been in use for a long time. I think where we're going is that what is needed is implants with feedback. So the body needs to be regulated. If it has a disease which is a failure of regulation, then we need to put artificial feedback in order to stabilize whatever it is that needs to be stabilized. So that might be coming from some sort of biochemical measurement. But that's in the future, I think. I think what is possible in the near future is detecting brain activity and using that in order to be an input to some sort of controller, which then regulates stimulation in order to control something. So you imagine having an implant which perhaps has an accelerometer in it for detecting particular movements of the head, and also electrodes on the brain surface for detecting what's called local field potentials. So that's looking at the electrical activity of a large number of brain cells and using that to detect particular rhythms, particularly frequencies present in the brain, which are indicative of something you're trying to control.
Can I ask a really, really basic question? Is how well do we understand the brain and how it functions? Do we completely understand it, or are there many mysteries in there?
I'm an engineer. I think you're asking the wrong man that question. I'm sure we don't understand it. It's so vastly complicated.
So the reason why I ask that is specifically in terms of implants is, do we know the effects that they are having? Because maybe we measure the effects of what we want to happen as a result of these implants, but we're talking about such tiny movement of electrons, as Jack says, that can an implant have effects that we aren't aware of? And if so, how are we measuring that? Could any implant have unseen consequences is what I'm saying.
I think most of this is very empirical. I think a lot of what is known about the brain has been learnt from patients with lesions. A lot of knowledge was gained during the First World War by people looking at injured soldiers and what they could and couldn't do any longer. It's pretty gruesome stuff, And I think finding out that stimulating in parts of the brain with deep brain electrodes has largely been empirical. People have tried it out and it's worked, and presumably they observe the patients following having one of these things for side effects.
That process of monitoring people, presumably it has to go on for a long time to see if it's having any real effect. And one of the things when we were discussing this in advance was you're talking about maybe the use for implants in the future for psychiatric conditions. How people think is a very difficult one to monitor. I suppose if it's in connection with particular conditions, then you can monitor how the condition is progressing or being suppressed. But maybe in terms of other effects that it might have, how can we judge that? Or is that something that we're looking at?
I doubt that it's right to think of this as influencing how people think, except in the sense that if you're depressed, it's very difficult to think. So if you imagine that you were depressed and then an implant was used in order to prevent you being depressed, to raise you out of your depression, then you could start thinking clearly again. That's how I imagine this is. There are, of course, possibilities that implants can be used for other things. I mean, people have thought about using implants to make soldiers more courageous, for example. And I don't know how far that can go, but for meeting current clinical needs, I think it's more about meeting these medical illnesses which people have and which are so common. So I think there's a huge motivation to improve and use implants for dealing with the vast number of people who are now mentally ill.
What do you think about the possibility of implants being more routinely inserted into people for, as you said, potentially to make soldiers more courageous, or for potentially implants that could be monitoring parts of someone's body to provide a kind of early warning system for problems that may have just started occurring but might not be sort of surface level at that point? Do you think the use of implants will increase, perhaps even beyond just people that have suffered from, say, traumatic brain injury or spinal damage?
I think it's likely to increase for mental illness, certainly, which is an enormous number of people, isn't it? There's vast incentive to do it because it's so expensive. The bill for mental health is reckoned to be 60 billion a year or something now, which is colossal. And, we know the NHS's costs are way out of control. We know what can be done about this. If the people really are mentally ill, there must be a good case for using implants which are relatively inexpensive to try and deal with it.
But is there a concern that could be sort of an over-medicalization of a problem that could be dealt with through behavioural change or other methods like that?
Like good parenting, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
We can wish. Of course, that would be much better. But if actually we can't find enough therapists to provide the talking therapy to all the patients, and an implant costs a relatively small amount of money, would that not be the better thing to do?
So you think implants could be a cost-saving exercise for bodies like the NHS going forward?
I fear that that's the case, and I would prefer it if it weren't that way round, but I think that is how it is. And, I think we get used to things. My mother has a pacemaker. She was a bit nervous about having it, but now she's got it. She doesn't, I think, notice it any longer. It's just there.
And I don't know if there's your kind of level of expertise, but how do you feel about the kind of risks that are presented by implants? I mean, there have been discussion in the past about even things like hacking, cybersecurity, pacemakers being disrupted through various means, potentially by nation states through kind of espionage and, all that kind of stuff. I know that's probably not your area of expertise, but do you think that implants present a potential vector for attack that, is there a risk factor?
I mean, there must be a risk, but I don't see why it should be particularly large. There's an important distinction between passive and active implants, I think, here. Mm-hmm. So the sort of implants which I've mostly made have been passive because they don't have batteries. So they're powered by electromagnetic induction, and that's used for both sending signals to them, receiving signals from them, and for providing power to them.
So is that effectively powered by the human body itself?
No, it's powered from the outside by something which the patient puts on.
Right.
So if the patient doesn't put it on, their implant is inert.
Right.
Of course, things like pacemakers, which do have batteries in, so they're active implants, and in a sense they're more inherently dangerous because there's a battery there to drive electrolysis, to drive destructive processes, but also, coming to your security point, they're active, and if there's a communication available to them, then potentially other people could communicate. But I suppose I can't imagine that can't be made reasonably safe with obvious sort of security arrangements with ID numbers and things.
A bit of encryption,
yeah.
Sort of going along those same sort of lines is one of the things I was reading about was a project on neural implants at Imperial, and they are looking at, in particular, urinary conditions and having a chiplet that goes in the brain that can be used to solve that. But the idea is that they have a whole library of chiplets that can be used for all sorts of different conditions. And then it struck me, my electronics background, looking at the FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays, where you can, they're essentially an electronic chip that you can program to do whatever you want them to do. So could it be that people just have their medical chip put inside them, and then it can be programmed for what's ever necessary, either in controlling conditions or maybe diagnosing or monitoring conditions?
That brings us to the topic of regulation, which I'm not an expert on, but I do know that it's a very important matter for these devices. I mean, clearly we're all concerned that they've got to be safe. But on the other hand, I've been involved with a company that's made implants for controlling the bladder after spinal cord injury. And I've known that company for 40, 50 years now. And they were destroyed, really, by the regulations. They were unable to, they're providing this service, this implants for spinal cord injured patients worldwide. But the number of centres putting these devices in wasn't very great. The number of sales was not very great. But it was very important to the surgeons who used them and to their patients. And yet that company didn't survive because the regulatory burden was too great. And I think this is really important. We'd like to be able to provide specialised implants to relatively small groups of patients like spinal cord injury, tailored to their needs. And the initiative at Imperial you talk about, that's great if it means that they can put together an implant for particular types of patient relatively easily. But it's only going to work if the regulators will allow it to work in that way. So the regulators will accept that the technology used in this family of devices is standard. So they don't have to go back to testing all the technology every time. They just have to decide whether this particular chiplet, as you put it, is fit for purpose.
So what's the big problem here? Is there an international regulation, or is it on a country-by-country basis? What is the problem? Is it just this huge time spans that any medical device has to go through to be tested? Or is there something in particular about implants that makes the regulation particularly difficult?
Well, yes. I mean, the implants are the sort of highest risk category of medical device, obviously. The regulations, we used to be in the European regulation system. Now we're outside it. But actually, I don't think it's changed significantly. I think the British regulatory environment is pretty much the same as the European one, but a bit different. But I suppose what I've always found particularly tiresome about it is that for the manufacturers, it's a sort of rolling problem. So they get approval for their device. They start implanting them in patients. You'd think then they should be, they should have got through. They can get on with running their business. But no, the regulators will come back next year and say they want more tests done on something else. It just is a continuous cost to them trying to keep up with these regulations that bear down on them the whole time.
Well, so do you think that the burden of regulation is greater than the potential medical problems that could be solved? The lack of risk-taking is too extreme, that there should be, to a degree, a higher degree of risk-taking, because ultimately you're going to see more people who have their conditions improved versus potential accidents that happen.
Personally, I do, yes. I think patients very often want to be able to decide for themselves whether they want to take a risk. And I think that's right and proper, as they've got to make the balance between the risk and the possible benefit. And what the regulations sometimes do is to just take that away from them and just sort of arrogate making a decision to some remote committee who aren't going to experience this themselves. And I don't think they're the right people always to make decisions. Of course, there are technical decisions they may have to consider, but it may just come down to, are you willing to take this risk in order to possibly make these benefits?
So is this a massive roadblock for the sector?
I think regulations is a massive cost to the sector. I think the cost of implants is largely paying for regulations. It's not the technology. The implants are small electronic devices, the sort of thing which we normally, we'd expect to spend £50 on eBay or somewhere to get something of that sort of complexity, but cost £50,000 when they come from a medical device company.
Will there come a point, though, when any drug, for example, has to go through a lot of regulation and approval before it can be used? And the cost of actually manufacturing that drug is peanuts. But when you get over that hurdle, and you're going through that hurdle at the moment as a sector, I'm guessing, of trying to be accepted, those levels of approval, and then when you do get over that, and it will become a lot more affordable for, like you say, the NHS.
Well, it should be the same, but I think it's too much of a deterrent at the moment. It's really difficult for people to go from university-level research projects through to their first-in-man trials at the moment. Very, very little university research turns into anything real, actually.
What about if there's things like the European Horizon program, where there's got to be industrial partners involved, as well as the practitioners and the academic element to it as well? Does the Horizon program cover medical projects, or is there an equivalent? Whereas they're trying to do something where there is sort of a route to market at the end of it.
I don't know. It's a long time since I've been involved with European grants. As they were 20 years ago, I was very unimpressed by it. Of course, there's lip service to these things, having a route to market. But I think, from my experience, very little actually got through that way. It's just far more difficult than the funders seem to understand. It's not that you start with this blue sky idea, you do 5-year research project, and then a company says goody goody and is taking it to market. It's 20 years, 25 years to actually do that. It's a very long haul, and that's got to be understood.
Well, looking to the future, are there any interesting or promising materials or technologies coming up that are perhaps only at the sort of prototype stage, but you think could make a splash kind of in the next 5 to 10 years when it comes to medical implants?
I think from our own recent work that it's looking quite promising now that we could make devices which are of the order of 10 millimeters across, 10 by 10 by 1, 10 by 10 by 2, to really tiny little things, which could be implanted by keyhole surgery sort of deep in the body. And there's a lot of interest in connecting those to much smaller nerves than we've done in the past. So the sort of thing I was talking about earlier, stimulating motor nerves going to muscle. So these are nerves which are sort of 2 millimeters to 5-6 millimeters in diameter, quite big things which you can easily dissect out and put a cuff, an insulating cuff round with electrodes inside it. But I think a very good case has been made now for what's called bioelectronic medicines. And the idea behind that is a lot of the major diseases, the thing which kills mostly, are inflammatory conditions, and they're failures of the regulation of the system causing this inflammation. And if you could interact with much smaller nerve fibers, autonomic fibers, you may be able to restore that. So work has started on stimulating the vagus nerve, stimulating that and relieving people with arthritis. So arthritis is an inflammatory condition. And Kevin Tracy, who's an American doctor who's a great advocate of this, believes that these so-called bioelectronic medicines will have a huge effect long-term on dealing with the major diseases that are the ones which kill most of us.
I suppose on that thread, do you have any knowledge of implants that could help with things like dementia and kind of the atrophy of people's brain function as they get older? Because that's obviously a major societal issue.
I mean, coming back to what we said earlier about dealing with mental health conditions, I'm sure there are lots of possible implants which would enable regulation of function to help there.
Okay, well, I think it's probably a good place to finish off, but maybe as a last question, I introduced the podcast by saying that we may be at an inflection point for implantable medical devices. Given what you've told us in the last hour or so, there's clearly a lot of obstacles in the way of that happening, but to what extent do you think that still stands, and is this an exciting area of the medical sector to be in at the moment?
I think it's a very exciting area. I mean, in spinal cord injury, which is what I know about, the prospect for patients is completely transformed in the last 20 years. So nowadays, what we expect is that the physiotherapists will see new patients and will think about what sort of therapy are they going to give them, how much improvement can they expect to get, what's the best way of achieving that. I think there's no reason why we can't meet the need for these bioelectronic medicines to make devices which will have huge effects on people, just improving that body function. But I was talking about implants for restoring leg function to paraplegics. In the 1990s, I developed this implant, and we implanted 2 of them, one into a woman called Julie Hill. And we did this pretty carefully compared to our previous attempts.
Yeah.
It took a long time to select her and train her, and she had to decide whether she actually wanted to go ahead with this thing.
Yeah.
She did. And then we implanted it, and then we spent about 3 years, I should think, working with her these 2 days a week, trying to get the best possible performance from this thing.
Wow.
And a television company got hold of what we were doing and joined us few months before her implant, and then filmed her before and during the surgery and afterwards. And there's a lot of interviews and us trying to do things with cameras looking at us. So that was all right, quite something.
And what was the outcome for her?
Well, I mean, the research question was, if we stimulate these motor roots rather than the nerves, can she get useful leg function? And the answer was she couldn't really stand up straight enough, whatever we did. She could barely take steps, but she was rather good at cycling. She ended up with a mobile tricycle, so cycling on country roads.
Oh, wow.
And enjoying it. And her legs were fantastic. I mean, really strong.
Right.
From all this electrical stimulation she had. And I think she enjoyed herself. She just loved being on the television. I felt like a very feeble performer compared with Julie.
My wife asked me to ask this, is that can implants be used for pain relief?
Yeah. Yeah, as I said, spinal cord stimulation, so-called. Those chronic pain. The most common implants, the ones which have been used the most, are heart pacemakers, deep brain stimulators for Parkinson's disease, essential tremor and dystonia, spinal cord stimulators for pain, vagus nerve stimulators for epilepsy and depression, and cochlear implants for profound deafness. So it's one of the big categories of implant that have been used a lot is for chronic pain.
Does that include fibromyalgia?
Don't know, but it's worth asking. I'm sure you could easily find a website that would say what classes of patient those implants are for. But it's a very well-established treatment and low risk.
Is that because your wife suffers from that?
I suffer from fibromyalgia, but she's got chronic pain in her feet and can barely walk. So between the two of us, if we could have a family pack of implants, that would be perfect.
Maybe you could sort them out.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Nick. If anyone wants any more information on Nick's work or wants to contact him, they can do so through the UCL website or email him directly at n.donaldson@ucl.ac.uk. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, there's plenty more of its ilk available on our website, YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast from. And so for now, thank you very much for listening and goodbye.